Hello. In this presentation, I'm going to provide a brief overview of facial expressions of emotion in dogs. In order to do this, I want to start by saying a little bit about the importance of recognizing emotional states in working dogs and why just saying that they're stressed is inadequate. In order to understand the stress, we need to understand the emotional quality behind it. I'll explain the reasons why soon. I'm then going to say a little bit about how we go about reading dogs and highlight the difference between signals and cues when it comes to reading dog body language, and then focus in on what we know about the face, which is actually far less than you might appreciate. Some of the measures for assessing stress we've recently incorporated into a pet dog quality of life instrument, and I give you the reference here. The paper is freely available online, and this brings together some of the signs that are discussed here and validates them further. So, work for animal assisted intervention can be quite stressful, and this piece of work done in Poland highlights a range of behaviours that were seen in dogs working in AAI. And the important thing to appreciate is that the handlers didn't notice any signs of distress in the dogs at this time. Whereas if you look at the graph, and on the right hand side are the terms in English, there's a wide number of signs that we would probably think of as indicative of stress in dogs. I've just highlighted in yellow the ones that relate particularly to facial expressions, and these are the sorts of things that we'll be looking at in more detail. So whilst we see them occurring in this context, exactly what they mean is a slightly different question, and that's what I want to address in this talk. So if we think about stress has very many forms, and the emotional quality indicates the type of stressor that the animal is facing. So if we say the animal is fearful or frustrated, there are different problems and stresses imposed on the animal. And there are a range of different emotional qualities. We could add pain, separation distress, and potentially other negative emotions to that group. I'd include things like anxiety under fear, even though it's the sort of anticipation of something that is harmful. The other thing that the emotional quality adds to the definition of stress is it gives us important information for working out how to solve the problem. Because just looking at the context won't always tell us about the emotional challenge. If we think about somebody putting their arms around a dog, the dog may be stressed by it, but is that stress a sign of frustration or is it fear? All we know is that the child puts their arms around the dog and potentially gets bitten as a result. It could even be a response to pain if the child puts their arms on somewhere that is painful for the animal. So just looking at the context is not sufficient, and the danger is if we think about something and we draw a conclusion as to the underlying emotion, we just simply select the evidence to support that. An important thing to appreciate about emotions is why we have them in the first place. Emotional systems help us coordinate the behavioural response, the autonomic nervous system response, and the wider physiological response the body should make to salient information in the environment, things that are important to the individual. And they're very much concerned with responses that are subjective and may differ between one individual and another. But they can relate to responses to both the physical environment, physical items, or the social environment, which could be individuals in that environment and the relationship they have with it. Absolutely central to the idea of emotional responses is that the animals are categorizing the world around them on the basis of some sort of subjective value. And this creates biases in the way that we respond. So, for example, if you perceive something as being fearful, then your behavior becomes much more cautious. That's the consequence of the activation of fear. However, if you're frustrated by something, you become much more determined, and we see different types of behavioural responses in that situation. If we're thinking about social emotions, and even with emotional responses to the physical environment, it may be important to be able to communicate your emotional state in order to ensure that people are and other animals are interacting in an optimal way, in an adaptive way, in order to minimize the risks associated with living with others. So communication is a very important feature within the expression of emotions. Now, when we think about reading the signals and trying to read the emotional state, it's useful, I think, to distinguish between signals and cues. Signals are actions or small micro actions that have evolved the purpose for communicating, and they serve the benefit of the sender. They may also benefit the receiver, but they've evolved in the sender for that purpose of transmitting information. Cues are features we can read from another individual that can be to our benefit. It doesn't necessarily mean that they have a benefit to the sender. So, for example, there may be specific signals that an animal wants to send, but there may be other things that we can pick up, and they may be advantageous to the individual, but they're certainly advantageous to those others around. And so if we see that an animal is highly aroused, we might just be picking up on some of the signs. So, for example, the hair standing on end. That doesn't mean that that cue can't become a signal. So it might be that the hair in certain areas becomes adapted so that when the animal does become highly aroused, it becomes more prominent in one area than another. This is what we mean when we say that the hackles are up on a dog. One of the problems with reading the behavior of animals is, as humans, we tend to impose judgment and our own interpretation on what we're reading before we've actually described it. And this has caused immense problems with our understanding of communication in dogs. Because once we label something or we believe that an animal is in a particular state, we focus on those things that support it. This is what's known as the confirmation bias. And it's a natural trait that we have. But in recent years, we've started to develop methods which allow us to be much more objective. And in doing that, what we can do is we can describe the physical features of a signal or a cue and become much more objective because we can then gather all the information, do statistical analysis on the collections of signs and see where real differences lie in particular contexts, which might indicate differences in meaning. And we can do this for the face, and a system that's been developed for the face is the facial action coding system. We can also do this for other body regions potentially. We can look at the posture or stance of the animal and the wider behavior of the animal as well. The important thing to appreciate is that we know much less than we think about the meaning of all these signals and potential cues. And I'd like you to keep that in mind, because there's no shortage of books where people say what they believe to be the meaning of a particular signal or cue. And sometimes they just say, well, it's a sign of stress. But I hope I've already indicated that actually an animal's not going to just communicate a vague form of stress. It's going to have some emotional association with it as well, at the very least. Another thing to appreciate is the relationship between emotions, behavioural signs and cues and their evaluation. If we consider two emotional states here, fear in red and frustration in the green, then we can think that they're associated with certain behavioural styles or strategies. So in the case of fear, we'll probably want to avoid key stimuli, whereas in frustration, we're focused on controlling the environment. So as a result of that, we see certain specific actions or acts or signals, cues, etc. And the thing is, when we look at the list of behaviours that occur in this situation, then what becomes apparent is that they're not unique to a specific emotion. So a number of these signs that I've listed here might actually be found in both fear and frustration, but also the way that they do it. So for example, running. If you running away, then we may think that it's associated with fear, but if you're running towards the stimulus, we might tend to think of it as being associated with frustration. So we have to observe the environment and what the animal is interacting with. If it's running away, we call it flight. If it's running to something, then we would say it's chasing. At the end of the day, the physical description of the act is that the animal is running from A to B. We've interpreted the direction and the motivation in that particular situation. So we've already added a layer of interpretation, and we have to be careful about this. We want to see where the animal starts, where the animal finishes, and the behavior it does in between before we start imposing those sorts of interpretations. And this principle is true for a wide number of behaviors. So, we can think about the dog biting. If it's scared, we might be saying that it's defensive. If it bites when it's frustrated, we might say it's offensive. And likewise, some of the other behaviors listed here may be used by different emotional states beyond just fear and frustration. And we have to be aware of this and appreciate the fact that no behavior is unique, but depending on the context that we put it in, we ascribe certain meaning to it. So panting in the context of fear, we might say the animal is suffering from nerves, or tail up in the case of frustration, we might say that the animal is being quite dominant in its behavior. But the important thing to appreciate is no one behavior has a specific relationship or unique relationship with a given emotion. So we've got to be very careful in how we evaluate behavioral signs. Using the sorts of approaches that I've already mentioned of being objective, we have found that there are certain behavioral signs that might help us differentiate between different emotional states. But it's not about whether or not that sign occurs, it's actually about the rate at which the sign is shown and the proportion of time. So it's not the absolute occurrence. It's not that this ear position means this, it's the fact that there is more of it, or we see that being expressed more frequently. So in the case of happiness, we have an open, relaxed jaw, which is sort of objectively described in relation to certain muscle groups, as illustrated here. In the case of positive anticipation, then the nose lick and the pricking of the ears are particularly distinctive in terms of how much they occur. Both the rate and the proportion of time spent in those states increases. But on its own, it is not unique. And this distinguishes not just those two emotions, but those signals also distinguish between other emotional states like fear and frustration, which also have certain features that seem to distinguish them. So in this study, what we did, we actually distinguished between 4 different emotional states and looked at what it was about different signals that did it. And in the case of fear, it was sort of the panting behavior. Note, it's not the ears back. Ears back is often interpreted as a sign of fear, and yes, it does occur, but the frequency and proportion of time spent with ears back does not distinguish it from other emotional states. So we've got to be very careful about that interpretation. In the case of frustration, then we see a broadening between the ears, so the ears sort of being pulled apart more for more of the time when an animal is actually frustrated. Sometimes the context can be very similar for a given emotional state. And in this work, what we did is we looked at differences in the behavior of dogs in 2 situations where they were being denied a reward. If you think about it, when a dog is denied a reward, then it could be in excited anticipation, which is a positive state, am I going to get my reward? Or it could be in a negative state where it's saying, I want my reward, why isn't it here? So the context itself doesn't define it. And we set up the experiment, and the references here if you want to read it, and we looked for behavioural signs that helped us distinguish between the dogs in these conditions. In the positive anticipation, we saw, similar to the previous study, that the ears were coming together. Obviously, in a dog with dropped ears, you just see a narrowing of the base instead of the sort of pricking of the ears. And in the negative condition, again, we saw the pulling of the ears apart, as we'd seen before, but we also saw indications of nose licking, lips apart, and the jaw drop and the blink. Now, in this particular study, we were using food, so we've got to be careful that some of these signs aren't indicative of perhaps the anticipation of food, because you can see things like the nose lick was more associated with the negative condition in this study, whereas on the previous one it was associated with anticipation. But the previous study of anticipation was not as carefully controlled as this one, so we think that the nose lick, if it's associated with negative emotional state and not the food, then it may be more useful in that situation. But it just shows how we've got to be careful about ascribing a particular meaning in a particular context. We could do the same experiment, and indeed we have, using a toy rather than food in order to control for perhaps some of the mouth gestures that might be associated with the anticipation of food. If we look at mouth licking behaviour, and this is what I mean about a particular response being used in different emotional situations, then this is another scenario where we have looked at mouth licks. What we did is we exposed dogs to a series of visual images of people and dogs in happy and negative states, and we played them also recordings that might match the emotional states, or one of the emotional states or the other. And what we found is that the majority of dogs displayed mouth licking, but no, not all the dogs did, so it's not a signal that every dog necessarily uses. And it occurred in about a fifth of trials, between a fifth and a quarter of trials. What was interesting is we saw much more mouth licking behaviour in the context of when they were presented with human faces than when they were presented with dog faces. So mouth licking behaviour seemed to be a signal that the dogs would use more in the presence of humans than in dogs. Again, this illustrates the complexity of simple interpretations of the behaviour. And the vocalization, whether it was angry or happy, had no effect on the probability of the dog mouth licking. So in this situation, it seems that the mouth licking response is a response to a visual signal, and especially signals of visual threat from humans more than dogs, and they're more likely to show it. So we can start to see how sort of precise and intricate the signals may be. And in the final piece of work I want to show you, done by Florence Gournay in France, I want to show you how actually dogs may adapt their signals according to the circumstance. So she looked at dogs asking for food from a sealed container, and the dogs were either guide dogs or pet dogs. Well, obviously guide dogs are owned by people who cannot see, and what she found was that the dogs in that situation were much more likely to use a noisy form of mouth licking in order to get the owner's attention. Now, this doesn't mean they understood the owner was blind, but it seems that they, in that situation, used a more audible version of the expression. So, signals are going to vary very much through learning as well as context, and simple generalizations are generally not wise. So, just to finish off with, if you look at the literature, we generally have data to indicate that in fearfulness, things like the amount or frequency of panting, the listlessness of the animal, cowering, lip nose licking, wide eyes, shaking and running away, seeking safety or aggression when confined are indicative of fearfulness, whereas for frustration, parting of the ear base, flattening of the ears, nose licking, yawning, blinking and dropping of the lower jaw may be more indicative of frustration. Thank you for your attention.